Hello, my bookish friends. Welcome or welcome back. I'm Elizabeth. This is Reading Wryly, and today we're going to talk about all of the books that I read in April. It's a wrap-up. So this month I read 10 books, which is pretty on par for what I normally read. But my genres were very vast this month. I read thriller, I read horror, which you might expect, but I also read sci-fi. I also read true crime. I also read romance. What? Contemporary. Just like almost every book I read was so different. I had a relatively good month. Like I really don't have any huge complaints about any of the books that I read this month. They were all good. As usual, I will start with my lowest rated and work my way up to the highest rated book of the month. So hang in there. I do have 2 5-star books this month. So that's exciting. I will separate this down in the chapters below here to help you easily or more easily navigate this video. And also I'm going to pop up my social medias over here. So feel free to check me out over there as well. If you're interested, don't forget to like and subscribe if you like it. And let's talk about the books that I read. This first book that I want to talk about it might be my least favorite book, but I also just did not rate this because it is nonfiction and I don't like to rate nonfiction unless it is a 5-star book, which this was not. So I'm going to talk about this one first, and that is We Keep the Dead Close by Becky Cooper. This is a true crime case about the death of Jane Britton, who was a college student. She was actually an archaeology grad student at Harvard, and she was killed in her apartment in 1969. The case went unsolved for many, many years. The killer was later found based on DNA in 2018. Becky Cooper also went to Harvard, and when she went to Harvard, this case was not solved yet. She became obsessed with it, and so actually after Becky graduated, she went back to sit in because one of the suspects was the archaeology professor at Harvard. Now, this book is about the death of Jane Britton. This is Jane Britton, of course, but it's also about like 3 different things, I think. It's about Jane Britton, but it's also about Becky Cooper and her experience and her connection with this case, and her connection to it is almost unhealthy. We learn about Becky's experience as she is investigating this. And it's also about the abuse of power and the institutional oppression of women in academia, which of course I like, but is not exactly what I was looking for in this. This is a really fat book. This is, 400 and some pages, although just the resource list at the end is long as hell. Honestly, I didn't really care about Becky's story. I wish this had been told more succinctly. It felt so long. And maybe I've listened to too many true crime podcasts because this just is not my favorite way to consume true crime. I haven't read a lot of true crime books. Some of them I've liked more than this for sure. It felt a little bit meandering. It felt a little bit too much about Becky, not enough about Jane. And then the whole bit about the institutional oppression of women in academia could have been its own book, really. And we find out who the actual killer was. Like, I listened to this on audio, and when I found out who the killer was, I looked down and I still had 2.5 hours of audio. And I was like, what the hell are we gonna do for another 2.5 hours of this book? Like, we already know what happened. And there are some questions of is that the real truth? Is it not the real truth? But that being said, this book did make me think about truth in a way that is big and haunting. Truth in true crime especially, because so many people in true crime stories, depending on who is investigating it, you go back and whether or not you want to, you are biased because you are a human being and you are not perfect. And you're going to take people's reactions to things and the clues that you may or may not find differently than somebody else who is investigating the same thing, and that's just part of being human. And so really, when we think about it, we want to know the truth. We want to get down to the truth. But is that even possible? In a situation like this, you can know certain things. You can know what the evidence shows, how she was found, what her apartment looked like, etc. But at the same time, the exact truth of how that happened and the exact motives, we'll never know. We'll never know. And so it was a little bit unsatisfying at the end, but it did make me think about kind of big picture ideas about true crime and truth in general. So if you're interested in something like that, you may enjoy this, especially if you like a true crime book that the author kind of inserts themselves into. I understand why she would want to do that because you want to have a connection to it. You want to have a reason for telling this story, not just telling the story for the sake of telling the story, but it just wasn't exactly my cup of tea, and it was far too long. Let's move on. The next book that I want to talk about may disappoint some of you in the level of my enjoyment of it because it is so close to the bottom of the list here. I don't know if it's an unpopular opinion. This is a book that I feel like I should have liked, that I feel like is on par with some of my other favorite books as far as the character-driven story goes, as far as the weirdness of it, but for some reason it just did not click with me, and that is Death in Her Hands by Ottessa Moshfegh. I am giving this 3 stars. I can see the merit of this, and I see the literary prowess of this, what she's doing with it. I just had a really shitty reading experience with this book. Like, I did not care as I was reading it. We're following Vesta, and Vesta is this older woman. Her husband has passed from cancer, and she moved into this new house on this property. She's very lonely, and she has a dog named Charlie. She goes out into the woods one day, and she finds this letter under a rock. It says her name was Magda. Nobody will ever know who killed her. It wasn't me. Here's her body. But there's no body. There's no body. And so Vesta finds this note and she becomes obsessed. She starts building up this character of Magda in her life, and every single detail of Magda. And I think that was probably why I didn't like it. The way it's written, you know from the synopsis, this is an unreliable narrator. But the way it's written is almost manic. It's almost manic. It's almost like this stream of consciousness, and you know you can't trust Vesta, but at the same time, the whole book is about her imagination of Magda, and I'm like, I don't care about Magda. Most of the book, I was just not here for it. I just did not enjoy myself. I thought there was going to be some kind of big twist at the end, some kind of reveal. There really wasn't. There were a few weird things that started happening throughout the story as it went on, which piqued my interest a little bit, but it was not enough to sway me. I don't think Ottessa Moshfegh's writing is going to be for me. Even though I feel like I am her audience that she's trying to reach, I don't think I connect with her writing, and that's okay. The next book that I read is just a little short sci-fi novella by Becky Chambers. It's called To Be Taught If Fortunate. It was 153 pages, so just a really, really short, quick novella, and so much packed into that novella. So much. I gave it 3.5 stars. It's very quick to read. It has a lot to say. The world building was stellar, pun intended, and the themes were very heartwarming and visceral. We're following this crew on this spaceship. It's written in epistolary form from Ariadne, who is one of the people on this crew in this spaceship, in a place and time when we have found a way to explore other planets. So the key to that was to figure out how to keep one person alive for long enough in order to travel the time that it takes to reach another planet. And so this crew sets out to gain knowledge of the universe by exploring these other planets, and they find out how to change the human body to adapt to these other planets instead of the other way around. However, the atmosphere is our body adapts to that. Their goal is to go to each one of these, take scientific findings, and come back to Earth with that. In between planets, while they're traveling through eons and eons in space, their bodies basically shut down, and so they are preserved. They age, but it's very, very minuscule compared to an actual, like, how we actually age. So if they are put asleep for like 20 years, they may have aged 2 years. They stop receiving messages back from Earth. And so that's when you start to figure out what's going on and why Ariadne is writing this letter to anyone, for anyone to find. The crew on the ship are very diverse. They are each meant to play a specific role. It's really about life, time, humanity, finding our place in the world as humans. I thought it was smartly written. It is technical. If you like Andy Weir's books and you don't think that's like too technical as far as the sci-fi goes, I think you would like this one as well. The next story that I want to talk about is A House with Good Bones by T. Kingfisher. This was my first T. Kingfisher, and I was really happily surprised with the writing. Despite the charmingly grandma-esque cover, at least the US cover, this story is thoroughly modern in its telling. It's a Southern Gothic, which I still don't know if I like or not. I definitely enjoyed this book, but as far as like Southern Gothic themes, it doesn't really push me over the edge, but it's a fun ride. We're following Sam Montgomery. She is an archaeologist as well as an entomologist and a fucking badass. I loved Sam. She was sarcastic, she was witty, she was comfortable in her body as a fat woman, which I love that representation. So she was meant to go on this like 6-month, I think, or maybe it was 6-week expedition on this archaeological dig to look up bugs and whatnot. And they found a body. So those plans changed really quickly, but she has a bunch of roommates and they sublet her room.
Sublet it? Sublet?
I don't know. So she has nowhere to go. So she ends up going home to Mom's house. She grew up in this house with Mom. Grandma used to live there, who she calls Grand May. Her and her mom are very much alike. They like sitting down, drinking some wine together, joking around, watching some British detective shows. Very cozy. But when she gets home, Mom's acting a little bit weird. The house is completely different. All the walls are white, which is strange because her mom's a very charismatic, eccentric kind of character. So she's like, well, that's weird. Are you trying to sell the house? Like, why did you paint over everything? This is how Grandma had it when she lived here. Mom is acting really weird. There is something going on with her and she doesn't know what it is. She's not swearing. She's very aware of what she's saying. She's taken out these pictures that Grandma had in the house that are kind of problematic and she's hung them up and she's like, Mom, you've always hated that. Why? And Mom is just like,
everything's fine. Don't worry. It's fine.
She's acting like she's being overheard maybe, or somebody is listening. And she wants to tell her what's going on, but she's not alone, perhaps. The major imagery in this is roses, bugs, and vultures. There are these vultures that are hanging outside Mom's house and they just seem to always be around. And she's like, what's going on here? And so we're basically following Sam as she's trying to investigate what's going on, trying to like pull information out of her mom. Like, Mom, why are you being so weird? Like, are you losing it? Do I have to take you to a home? The end really goes there. It's out there. In fact, the end, the imagery is like actually really cool. I've seen reviews that said that some people weren't really into it until the end. I kind of felt the opposite. I really, really loved the characterization of Sam in the beginning, and the end was just a little like, it was a little campy for me. It was funny, but I don't know if it was meant to be that way or not. But if it was, great, because that's what I got from it. Yeah, it's just a little over the top, but if you like Southern Gothic books, I think you're really gonna like this. I'm definitely gonna be reading more from T. Kingfisher. I don't know why I had this bias against her. I'm so sorry, T. Kingfisher, based on one review 2 years ago that just stuck with me and I never read her books. But I really, really loved the writing style so much. I thought it was fantastic. It was funny and bright and felt very modern, very now, and smartly written. The next book I want to talk to you about was actually my book pick this month for the Midnight Society Book Club. So I'm not going to tell you too much about it. I'm getting ready to actually film a live show with Sav from Riveting Reads in, just a few hours here. So as of now, I don't know what anyone else thought of this. This is just my opinions. And I thought it was good. This is The Protege by Jody Gurman. And I did listen to the audiobook. Oh, is it like super shiny? Maybe I'll just pop it up here so you can see it better because I feel like it's shiny. In the story, we're following two perspectives. So it's multi-POV. This has been compared to Lane Fargo. And so I think that was one of the main things that attracted me to this. I was expecting very much like a good for her story, and I don't know that it hit the mark for the Lane Fargo reference, although I see where it came from. Insinuating that led me to believe it was something that it was not, I guess we could say. We're following Dr. Hannah Briers, who very much reminds me of Dr. Temperance Brennan from Bones, if you watch that TV show, which I love. I recently watched the entire series through and through. And so I think that's part of the reason I was attracted to this story as well. She is just not good socially. She's awkward socially, but she is this very accomplished forensic anthropologist, and she teaches at Mad River University, which is, I think, Northern California. And at this point, I think it's a made-up university, which is great because then you don't have like any kind of bias towards it, I guess. If it's not, that'd be interesting to know. But anyway, we're following her and she's just real weird, but she's great at her job. And then we're also following Winter Jones, who is her protege. She's her TA, and she's one of her best grad students. Winter is very good at pretending, very good at knowing what people want to see from her and presenting herself in a certain way in order to get what she wants. She's not so prideful that she needs people to know how smart she is, but she's got a plan and she's out for revenge. This isn't one that blew me away or blew me out of the water, but for what it was and for what I was looking for, I had a really good time with this. This is war for Winter. It is war. Winter repeatedly says all warfare is based on deception. And so deception is her goal here. She wants Dr. Briars to think that she worships her. She wants her to think all of these things. And so she starts taking down bits of her life one by one. I thought the pacing was really well done. I easily read this in just a couple of days. There was a little bit of romance in there too, which was kind of unexpected. I think the writing is good. It's very straightforward, but I don't think this is anything that's necessarily going to stand out for me or that I'm going to remember for a long time, but I did enjoy myself while I was reading it. Next, I read Mr. Mercedes by Stephen King, which is the first in the Bill Hodges trilogy. And I was convinced to read this by Beth from Beth's All Booked. Beth actually read all 3 of the books in this series this month for her book club, We Read King book club. And I didn't get to all 3, but I did read the first one and I really liked it. I don't typically, I'm not a diehard King fan. I could take it or leave it. I've had some of his books that I've really loved, like Misery, and others that I'm just like, this is so long. It's too rambly. It's, I didn't enjoy it. But this one goes right to the top for me. This goes right underneath Misery, I think, because this was more of your typical kind of thriller that I enjoy. It was character-based, but the plot was also really, really well plotted out, and it has these really dark themes that I love, a la Karen Slaughter, a la Lucinda Berry. The killer, the Mr. Mercedes killer in this story is deplorable. Him and his mother both, he is deplorable. And we start off following Bill Hodges. He's just retired. He's a retired detective, and he is not taking the loss of his job well. His job was his entire life. He doesn't know what to do. He's contemplating suicide. He does not know what to do with himself. And then he gets this letter from Mr. Mercedes. Mr. Mercedes basically was like the one that got away. He stole somebody's car, ran over a whole bunch of people, and he writes a letter to Bill Hodges to tease him. And so Bill Hodges is like, you know what? I got something to do now.
I'm gonna find this motherfucker.
He goes on his mission under the radar because he's technically not a police officer anymore or a detective. He kind of gathers friends along the way. They end up with this friend group of just like this very charming and odd friend group. Each of them are so distinctly their own characters. I had just a really fun time with this. It was fast-paced. It was not overly long like I might expect from a Stephen King book. And I'm really excited to read the second book and the third book in this series and see what happens. Next, I finally read this 165-page novella that I have had on my shelf for like a year. And I've been interested in for like a year, but could not get myself to pick it up because it didn't have an audiobook, and I'm ashamed. I'm ashamed. But now there's finally an audiobook, and that is And Then I Woke Up by Malcolm Devlin. There is finally an audiobook for this, y'all. I found it on SCRIBD. So excited to find that. The narrator was great. He actually reminded me his voice of Gavin from How to Train Your Gavin. And this story was awesome. I really loved this. Now, listen closely. This is a book about zombies, but it's really not about zombies. So if you're in this to read a book about zombies, don't go into it for that. Go into this for the social commentary. If you are like me and you like horror that has social commentary to it and has something to say, then definitely read this for that reason. And because it's not, when you think of a zombie book, this is not that. It's not that at all. But there are so many parallels in this book of the current political milieu in the US. And the whole main thing about this is narrative. What we've been told or what we think, the story that we think is happening, and is that what's actually happening? So there's this virus in the story. When you are afflicted with this virus, you see people who are not afflicted with it as zombies. So immediately you go into survival mode. You do what you have to do to survive because you think these zombies are coming after you. But we find out in reality that's not the case. They're just afflicted with this virus. Some people get it, some people don't, some people are immune, but also in this world they have this compassion commission for the people who are healthy and that don't have it. And they're like, look, these people think this. We have to be compassionate, you know, which I love. So they start leaving food out for them because the people who have the virus will just go in and, you know, go into a grocery store, into a house and raid it and get the food. Well, what they don't realize is that they keep going to the same houses and somehow they're restocked. And so the compassion, I think that's what it's called, compassion commission or something like that. They decide to make little changes that are just kind of odd to try to help people wake up. For instance, a room that is fully pink, everything in it pink, that would make them stop and think, wait a minute, something's wrong here. And then they might start seeing other things and other things. So we're following Spence. Spence is cured and he's living at this rehabilitation facility. And essentially once he woke up, he's like, has to deal with the things that he did. He has to deal with the people that he hurt when he was under the influence of this virus. And so the whole question is, do you want to know? Do you want to wake up? Or like some people in here, would you prefer to stay naive? Because sometimes naivety is bliss. Sometimes not waking up is easier. And that just has so much to say about our culture and the world that we live in. I thought it was really well written and strong, and the social commentary was on point. Definitely recommend this one if you have not read this yet. Next, I finally read Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin. Beautiful cover. Again, I've had this one forever and I just didn't pick it up ever. I'm really glad I did. It's not what I expected, but I totally understand why this book has just like taken over the book community. And it did a lot of things for me. It did a lot for my soul and for my heart. I do want to say this is not a romance. A lot of people do think this is a romance. It is not a romance. It is following two people who I believe are twin flames and are meant to be in each other's lives and, you know, come together and fall apart throughout their lives. But it's not a romance. It is a love story. It's a love story about friendship and humanity and life in general and the trauma and hardships that we go through, but also, you know, the little things that just make everything worth what we go through. We're following Sam and Sadie, and they meet when they're very young. And they bond over video games. They become best friends, they have a fallout, and then in college they meet back up and they decide to make a video game together. This is spanning over 30 years throughout their lives and starting in the 1980s. It's very messy. The relationships are just raw and messy, and you don't always root for these characters. You don't. Like, they are so fleshed out, but they're not necessarily, like, they are lovable, but they're so human because they are flawed. I've heard some people say like, oh, I went into this to escape reality and, you know, I hated these characters. I hated the choices that they made. If you're going into this, just don't go into it for that reason. Go into it to find a new perspective on reality, but not for escapism, because it's very tragic and it made me tear up several times. I've also read other reviews that said there was just a lot of like big words for no reason, and there are, but I liked that. I thought each of those word choices were poignant and therefore a reason, and I had to look up a couple of words here and there, but I also enjoy that because I like learning about new words. So that was fun for me. It was a little bit long. It ended kind of abruptly, but God, it just hit me in the emotions. And it's not a 5-star for me, but it is going to be a 4-star. And I completely see why everyone loves this. It is literary, it's contemporary. Oh, also, there's a lot about video games in here, obviously. You don't have to know anything about video games. I'm not a gamer, my husband is, but I'm not. And I actually really loved the gaming parts. Probably, like, they kept the action up for me, the gaming parts. And that was very interesting because all of the games that they make in of themselves are their own full story with full character arcs and all of these things. One thing that I did not like about this was that even in the 80s and 90s, 90s, all of the characters, like this has so much representation in here, which is wonderful. But that representation in the 80s and 90s specifically felt out of place, and that I felt like contradicted the realness of these characters, if that makes sense. Because I grew up in the 90s and I did not know anyone that was that aware at that time, as aware as we are right now, because right now is a cultural revolution really in what we're going through. Like, we are changing. This is basically like the 60s. It's like flower power, but now everyone is starting to become more aware of other people's plights and being more sensitive to that, and being more aware of, or becoming more aware of, trauma and psychology and things like that in other people. So that is very much a now thing. So it just didn't make a whole lot of sense to me when it was set in the 80s and 90s, but that's just a very small critique. It just really hit me in the feels, and I definitely recommend it. Next, we're getting into my 5-star books, y'all. 5-star books, I have 2 of them for you this month. I'm very excited to tell you about both of them. The first, oddly, is a romance. It's Part of Your World by Abby Jimenez. I'm picky about romances. I don't read a lot of them, but I don't like specific things about romances. I don't like smutty. And again, I'll say this, if you do, that's fine. And I'm not a prude. I just like, that's not what romance is about for me. That's not what gets me hooked. It's like the tension and this like, I have that like feeling when you first get to know, when you first find someone and you first fall in love. That's what romances are about for me. So this one wasn't particularly smutty, and so if you like smut, you may not like this one, but it was so well written. So well written. We're following Alexis and Daniel. They're very different people. This is an age gap though. The age gap thing doesn't really come into play. It's not part of the conflict really, which I loved because they're both plenty old enough. Alexis is 37 and Daniel's 28. This is set in Minnesota. He lives out in this really, really tiny town, a village really, outside of where she lives in the city. She is an ER doctor, and she has this legacy to protect.
And I can't help but thinking about Hamilton every time I say that.
It's just a legacy to protect.
They both do, really. She comes from this long line of Montgomerys, and this hospital that she works at, there has been a Montgomery in for 125 years. Her parents, both of her parents work there, just retired. It's just her and her brother. And her brother decides, hey, just kidding, I'm not gonna do this anymore. I'm going off to Cambodia. And so she's stuck. Also, her long-term fucking asshole of an ex-boyfriend is the head of surgery in this hospital, so she can't leave because she's the only Montgomery there. She has to deal with him. They also own a house together, so they have to deal with that. She has to see him, and it's torturous. She's going to a funeral, and she goes through this small town. That's where she meets Daniel. Daniel is the mayor of this small town, also a legacy of his.
It's just a legacy to protect.
That his parents have had from years and years and years. His family owns this like beautiful like Victorian mansion, and he really can't afford to live there, but he takes care of it. He lives on the property in like the garage, and he rents it out as a bed and breakfast and does everything on there. He, you know, cooks the meals, he takes care of the people, he's very charismatic and wants to make people feel comfortable. There was no red flags in Daniel. No red flags. He was so sexy, in tune with his emotions, in tune with his feelings. He's also a carpenter. He makes art on the side, and they meet under these unexpected circumstances and they fall in love. Oh my gosh, the amount of The Princess Bride references in this, they both love The Princess Bride, and The Princess Bride banter is on point, and it sucked me in. That's what really got me in the heart because I love Princess Bride so much. One of my favorite movies ever. It also does not have that like odd miscommunication thing. You know, there's always going to be a third act conflict in a romance, but it was set up in a way that just made so much sense. Both of them are kind of stuck where they grew up. They have commitments, they have legacies.
It's just a legacy to protect.
They have things going on that do not include being able to move 2 hours away. And so this whole time there is this conflict between them of like how we really care about each other, we really love each other, but we can't make this work. There's no way to make this work. And I did see the path that Jimenez was creating for that to happen, and I just thought it was so lovely and just a really, really fun departure from what I usually and typically read. So I'm so glad I finally got to this one. Lastly, we have Take It Back by Kia Abdullah. You may have remembered if you've seen my previous wrap-ups, I don't know if it was last month or the month before, I read Next of Kin by Kia Abdullah and really, really loved that one. So I decided to get into her backlist and I read Take It Back, and I'm definitely seeing this trend. I'm starting to get an idea for her authorial voice and her style in her thrillers, and it's different. It's so different than other thrillers that I've read. She has a vibe of her own that is so needed in modern thriller canon, because she has a way of talking about social issues and social commentary while also breaking your heart into pieces and then flipping a switch and throwing everything that you thought you knew on its head. Now, this one wasn't as twisty as Next of Kin, I will say that, but I was enthralled for the entire book. I could not stop reading it. And this also is a legal thriller. Maybe I'm just a fan of legal thrillers. I haven't really explored that yet. Or maybe I'm just a fan of Kia Abdullah. Also, we have representation for Muslims in both of her books that I've read so far, which has been really fantastic. I think there is space for those kind of characters, and we need more of those kind of characters. So let me tell you what it's about. We're following Zara. Zara is a Muslim woman, and she is just like this brilliant legal mind. She was on track to be a top person in her field.
Top person? Really?
A litigator, and she gave that up to become an advocate for women who have been sexually assaulted and things of that nature. And so she's trying to change her life. She's also addicted to, I think, opioids or oxy or something. I don't know. She's addicted to pills, and that's kind of taking over her life. She's very much part of the Muslim community, but she also has some trauma associated with that because her parents arranged her marriage for her, and that did not work out. And when she left her husband, she was kind of shunned by the community. So anyway, this girl walks in one day, Jody. Jody's a white girl, and she is 16 years old. She has a facial deformity. She is exceptionally vulnerable, especially in social settings. She's awkward. She comes from a family where she lives with her mom, and her mom blames her for her dad leaving. She's just had it really tough. And Jody comes in and says that she was sexually assaulted and RAPED, I don't know if I'm allowed to say that, by 4 boys in her class. Also, Jody's best friend is a biatch, total bitch, and does not support her. Mom doesn't support her, and Jody is going out on a limb to tell Zara what happened to her. But these 4 boys that she's accusing of assaulting her, sexually assaulting her, are all Muslim boys from well-to-do immigrant families who really their families have they've worked so hard in order to give their sons this opportunity to live in America and to make something of themselves and to kind of have that American dream. And so it all comes down to he said, she said, because their stories are all, they make sense too, but Jody's does too. And she's accusing these Muslim boys of this, and Zara herself is Muslim. So the community becomes enraged that she is not defending her people, but Kia Abdullah does this really great job of highlighting that intersectionality. She's like, why am I a Muslim before I'm a woman? She's like, something happened to this woman and I need to protect her. And meanwhile, her entire community there's this backlash, this huge upheaval from the community to where she's getting threats, and her, even her life is on the line at certain points. And so as we go through this legal process, we find out more and more things. We find out the truth of what actually happened. It's heart-wrenching. It is sad. It's so enthralling. Like, I could not take my ears off I was going to say my eyes off the page, but I could not take the earbuds out of my ears, I should say, because I did listen to this, as to be expected. And It was so good, and I loved where she took it. I loved how it ended. I thought it was perfection, literally no critiques. I wouldn't change a thing. I think it was great. I think if you like a legal thriller, if you're a kind of person where you're kind of annoyed by thrillers, modern thrillers that are just over the top and ridiculous, and you're like, no one would do that. That's ridiculous. Then I think you would like this one because it feels so real. It feels so flawed and so true to life. The motives feel real. And you feel compassion for every single one of these characters to the point where you're like, I don't know what to believe. And you just have to, there's this compulsion to keep reading because you have to find out what actually happened. So I highly recommend this one. Kia Abdullah is just rising up the ranks as far as my favorite authors go. I'm so excited to read even more from her, and I haven't found a dud yet. And that's it. Those are the books that I read in April. 10 books. It's been a good month. I hope to continue this trend. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you liked this. If you watched this to the very end, give me praise hands. Give me praise hands in the comments down below. Also, let me know what your favorite book was that you read this month. I'd love to know. Love book recommendations. If you find that you've read something similar to one of these that I loved, of course, I want to know about it. Of course I do. And that being said, don't forget that life is short, so read Wryly. Cheers, and goodbye.